from my career in South Wales. Most of the faces around the table are quite familiar. Perhaps I'll just touch on briefly what I've done in the last 31 years since I moved out of Newport. As you know, I went to Watford as divisional engineer, as a result of which I became eventually the engineering and safety director of Carillion Rail, which did bring me back here a bit for a while. And then moved on to the Rail Accident Investigation Branch as Deputy Chief Inspector. And I did that for 5 years until I was coming up to retirement age, not quite up to it, but I was about 2 years off civil service retirement age. And Jim Cornell, which is a name that the older ones of you will remember, decided that he wanted to stand down as Executive Director of the Railway Heritage Trust. So the job was advertised, and I put in for it. The interviewing panel was Bill McAlpine, who was a trustee of the Festiniog, and Jim Cornell, who was normally one of my referees. So I got the job, and did 12 years as the Executive Director. I retired from that 2 years ago. In the meantime, Bill McAlpine, of course, had passed away. Jim had taken over as chairman. He made it very clear that was on a temporary basis, because Jim himself is well into his 80s now. Really believe it, he still plays tennis every day. But anyway, when I said that I was retiring, Jim said, basically, no, you're not. I'm retiring, you're becoming chairman. So I'm now doing that. Right, how do we get this to actually show what is on the screen? Because I'm not agreeing at that.
You go into you might have to drag it onto the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you do that.
And then you need to share on Teams. We need to share on Teams.
Now we need to share it in Teams as well, yeah.
Right. So I don't need to do anything else with that?
No, you've got to share it on Teams as well. Yeah. That's it.
Excellent.
Brilliant. We're ready. That's it.
If I've now lost. Oh. So if I touch that. That's all right. I'll just see what I'm. Yeah. Look at that rather than looking at the screen. So I'm going to talk about railways and the Great War. I'm going to go back a bit further than that, and start on the 15th of September 1830, which is the date when really the railways involvement with the military began, because that was the day the Liverpool and Manchester opened. I'm going to talk through the 19th century, some of the issues of railways more leading up to how the railways got ready for the Great War, because they were preparing for war for a long time before it actually even became a threat. And then look at what happened in the mobilisation at the start of the war in the early days, how the railways helped to move around the United Kingdom, what the railway did in terms of production for the war, how it delivered things to the front lines, by which I mean the back of the front lines, because getting stuff from the factories to the back of the front lines was one operation. Getting it from the back of the front lines actually up to where it was needed for the fighting was another operation. Look at some of the things with the railway men at war, some of the things with the women in the industry, and close by looking at railway war memorials. Probably worth explaining just briefly how I got into this. When I left the RAIB and started work for the Railway Heritage Trust, for 5 years, I've been spending half my time in Derby, which is where the RAIB's offices are. And a few months after I moved across, some drug addicts attacked the Midland Railway War Memorial in Derby and pulled off all the names of the fallen, which were all on bronze plaques. And they were going to sell these to try and raise money for drugs. Fortunately, they were so heavy they couldn't carry them away. So I got them back the next day. And my former colleague rang me up and said, what to do about this? Well, my grandfather had fought in the Great War. My great-grandfather had worked for the Midland Railway as a goods guard and eventually an inspector. So I was quite interested in the Midland Railway War Memorial, and I put some money up and had some interesting debates with Network Rail, and didn't even know they owned it. But eventually Network Rail put the other half of it up, and we had got the memorial back and restored by November the 11th that year, so there would be a proper remembrance service at it. But that started me looking at all the Railway War Memorials. It turns out it's about 400 of them scattered around the country. And I've documented all those war memorials. I now have a full list, which I still keep up to date, even in my quote retired unquote state. So I'll talk about those as well. So, as I said, go back to Liverpool and Manchester Railway. And on that first day, Duke of Wellington was present, and as we all know, the then President of the Board of Trade, William Huskisson, wanted to speak to the Duke. So he got off the train and walked across to speak to him, and was in front of rockets, was knocked over, basically lost his life shortly afterwards. But the Duke was very interested in how quickly he could move troops between Manchester and Liverpool. By the time they had a through railway to London, which was about 14 years later, they realised they could move a battalion between London and northwest cities in 9 hours, compared with the 14 days it used to take to march them there. And obviously a key issue at that stage was how quickly you could get troops to the Irish ports, so that if there was trouble in Ireland, you could get troops over there very quickly. So the military was interested in the railway right from the word go. There are a series of wars. We'll look briefly at the Crimean War, the American Civil War, Franco-Prussian War, and the Boer War, because there were lessons from all of those that were learnt in how the British dealt with the Great War. So I look at this slide and I think the more things change, the less they change. You know, we talk about Sebastopol now and battles there in the Crimea. But we had a harbour at Balaclava, and we were trying to take Sebastopol, and they had to get materials up. It's only about 7 miles, but shifting those materials by road was a disaster. And actually feeding the material to the troops at the front line was extremely difficult. So the military decided they wanted better roads. Basically said, send us some road builders. And some of the contractors said, hang on guys, we'll build you a railway, it'll be much better. And I think it was Petter actually went out there and built the railway in 7 weeks flat. It was a horse-worked railway, it wasn't a locomotive-worked railway. But it solved the logistics issue once they had got the soldiers out of running it, because one of the very early lessons that comes up again and again and again is the military should be telling you what it wants. We want this number of shells, etc., but not how to do it, because they don't have the faintest idea. And the fact that you can take a wagon up the line loaded, you've got to take it back empty pretty damn quickly, seems to be beyond the military mind. So that was really the first campaign where the railways were involved. And the next one was the US Civil War. As you can see, looking at this motive power roundhouse, it was pretty bloody for the railways. And a lot of the war was fought up and down the railways. The Buster Keaton film, The General, All Right, was a 1920s film. There's a lot of truth behind it. And the South did not manage its railways. All the railways in the North basically were standard gauge. All the companies in the South, each one built their own gauge. And the North, the United States controlled the railways in the North. The Southern states did not control their railways. And as a result, the North was able to mobilise and move troops around much better. And eventually ended up winning the war. But as you can see here, a lot of damage to railway infrastructure as the campaigns tended to go up and down the railways. A few years later, we have the Franco-Prussian War. The French had largely left private companies to build their railways in geographical areas. If they didn't have competing railways in the way we did, but each railway was built in a particular area to meet the business needs of that railway area. The Prussians had built their railways very much with war in mind. So they had both radial lines up to the frontier and lines running along the frontier and 10 miles back and 20 miles back. So they could move their stuff around and control it much better. And they had organised and were ready to move their railways forwards into France when the war started, because they had manoeuvred to get the war, although the French declared war on the Germans. Bismarck had manoeuvred them to the point where that was necessary. They didn't get it all right. They never took on the French loading gauge was slightly smaller than theirs until they advanced and found that all their engines suddenly didn't have chimneys. And if you look at German engines in the latter part of the 19th century, the earliest part of the 20th century, they actually all have hinged chimneys, so that should war break out with the French again, just fold the top of the chimney back with them on French railways. The French railways were not properly controlled, and it was chaos. One of the reasons why the French did so badly was they couldn't support their troops with the railways behind the line, but they still managed to blow bridges. That's a German train where the French did manage to blow the bridge. And something that became much more of an issue in later wars was as troops were moved forward, how do you feed them? And you see here a group of German troops in a station buffet, but that's not necessarily the best and the only way to do it. The logistics for the food for the troops is every bit as important as the munitions, and the Napoleonic version of living off the land with the size of armies. The Great War was just not possible. And of course, it was too static. The Napoleonic version, the armies were advancing or retreating, so there was lots of new land always coming under their control. And then we had the Boer War. Again, very much a war up and down the railway lines. And this was one particular train. Somebody had the bright idea that we had an armoured train, it couldn't be attacked. So here you see all the troops getting onto the armoured train, and there was a journalist getting onto the armoured train by the name of Winston Spencer Churchill. And they chuffed off up the line. And as soon as it had gone about 10 miles, they found there weren't any rails in front of them because the Boers had taken the rails away. They tried to go back, there weren't any rails behind them because the Boers had taken the rails away from there as well. So they were stuck, and the Germans the Boers couldn't shoot them. But guess what? The engine ran out of water. And they ran out of water. And I think, as we all know, Churchill ended up, all these troops ended up as prisoners of war. So again, what you can and can't do with railways. There's a big lesson here. And again, the military tried to run the railways and made a right arse of it, and they ended up sending out railmen to run them. There was a lot of legislation. 1842 and 1871 acts were passed that basically said if there's a war, the army does what it wants with the railway. And the railways pointed out that they did have other things to do than support the military. But it wasn't really until 1896 when they set up an Army Railway Council, which included railway managers, that they began to get a sensible approach to how the railways could be run if there was a war. And as I say, in the Boer War, the railwaymen went out and eventually ran the railways, and much better support for the armies as they advanced. And from 1904 onwards, we had mobilisation timetables, which is interesting because, of course, in 1904, the thinking was we were mobilising against the French. And it wasn't until a few years later that we decided that we were friends with the French, but we wanted to mobilise against the Germans. And we had a lot of soldiers, 200 battalions, and there were specialist railway battalions, part of the Royal Engineers. They served in the Boer War. The oldest war memorials I know, the Boer War memorials, there's one at Derby Midland Station, and there's a massive garden for the Railway War Memorial in Crewe, some way from the railway. But the railways had to move the reserves, the volunteers around the country for training and manoeuvres. And of course the battalions needed moving as well. So by the time we came up towards the railways were very well used to moving troops and their equipment around the country. Any North Welsh bias in this lecture is purely deliberate. Just one example, Trawsfynydd, up near Blaenau Ffestiniog, the branch to Blaenau Ffestiniog, totally out of the way branch, no use at all for passengers because there weren't any, no use at all for freight because there wasn't any, and then they went to build a military camp for training troops. And all of a sudden, a line that was basically run with 042 side tanks and 060 pannier tanks had to be upgraded as far as Traus to take the big 260s. Of course, it isn't just, you don't just have to take the men, you have to take all their equipment, all their horses, all the ammunition. These pictures at Trawsfynydd just give you some idea of what was involved in moving troops around. And the railway was doing this before the war started. And some of the camps were completely out of the way. This is Aberystwyth. And the only way to get troops up there was on the Vale of Rheidol. The Vale of Rheidol didn't have enough engines. So poor old Palmerston, which seemed to always be the engine that was sent to other places by the Ffestiniog, was sent to work on the Vale of Rheidol for a time as well. And it actually went down every summer before the war and then several years after the war until eventually the Ffestiniog decided they couldn't spare it anymore. And the Great Western had to build the third 262 Prairie. Nobody was expecting a war to break out in 1914. And even after Sarajevo, there was no expectation that it was going to end up in a major war. And it was only about 8 to 10 days before war was declared that everybody realised this really was going to happen this time. And all the territorials were in Wales and elsewhere on manoeuvres. They all had to be got back, the volunteers, and that took about 100 special trains in itself, organised almost overnight, to get all those guys back to their bases. And at the same time, planning to get the British Expeditionary Force together and get it over to France as quickly as possible. Mobilisation of BF, war was declared on the 3rd of August. The mobilisation, actual moving of the troops, started on the 10th. The next 17 days, those numbers are. John, you've just written a book about moving freight around at short notice. 689 trains in 27 days organising. It's very different how we reacted in those days. But an absolutely massive job, and it was all done amazingly smoothly. The trains, all the companies were working together. The trains were going down to Southampton, offloading the troops, engines round to the other end and back again. And the Didcot Newry Southampton line, of course, was particularly essential for that. And we see here a group of Scottish troops about to go off, and of course, for the women folk particularly, they don't even ever know if they're going to see their men folk back again or not. As the war went on, that got much worse. And Birmingham New Street, we've actually worked out exactly where that is, and the tram there is between the Midland and North Western stations when there used to be two separate stations. But a group of guys being mobilised at New Street there. And moving horses to the front. Normally when you move horses, you have to have a nice horse box. I mean, those of you who remember Hornby Double will remember they have a lovely horse box with room for the groom to go with it and everything. Those of you who are that old will also remember the Airfix cattle wagon, and that's what's used for moving horses at the war, because suddenly vast numbers of horses were needed, particularly in the early days, because that was how they got all the ammunition to the front line. And there was the assumption that you would break through the front line and the cavalry would then advance through the breach in the front line. So all the cavalry were held in reserve, ready to attack, which they never did, of course. And everybody assumed that there'll be less traffic on the railways if we're at war, and therefore staff would have to be laid off, be less trains running. and the opposite happened. Traffic built up for the military massively, and the civilian traffic held up. Particularly early in the war, there was no stopping of holidays, no stopping of dining cars to start with. And vast numbers of the staff volunteered to join the army. So the number of people who were available to operate trains went down very drastically. And a lot of retired staff were called back. And those retired staff called back at Didcot, and they look young. And there was a lot of movement in the opposite direction. Again, you think about Ukraine now, exactly the same has happened. And 75,000 people arriving at Dover in the first 9 months, mainly from Belgium, and they had to be moved to London or to other parts of the UK. A lot of them were taken on by the railway to help cover the gaps where railwaymen had gone and joined the forces. But there was concern about the security of the line and whether German spies had come over with them. So do we have security? And a lot of people were taken up guard in the railways in the early days. Not sure what benefit it gave, but they did it, and the numbers were reduced quite drastically as the war went on. So there we are at Rill. Welcome, vive la Belge. La Belgique. Somewhat different attitude from how we look at refugees these days. So lots of people turned out to welcome them. And guarding a tunnel. Not sure what good they did whatsoever. I suspect that was a posed picture, just to reassure me.
Standing slightly close to the track.
Yes, absolutely. The demand for traffic went up hugely, about 30% increase right the way through the war. There were troops moving to and from the front. Just one statistic, the Great Western ran 88,600 troop trains during the war. A lot of old rolling stock was retained to do this. Of course, when we get to Quintin's Hill, catastrophic results of that. There were the wounded coming back. They all had to be moved around. Munitions had to go forward. And empty shell cases had to come back because you didn't throw the shell cases away. You brought them back, reloaded them, sent them out again. At the other end of the country, the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow had to be kept supported with fuel and men. And the age-old problem that people look on wagons as stores, mobile stores. The army was the worst possible offender. Once they got a wagon or something, they'd keep the stuff in the wagon and wonder why the railway people were screaming blue murder about it. And right the way through the war, there were the conflicting demands of the army and railways for men. When we come to talk about memorials, I should come back to that point because it's a rather sad story. End of 1914, dining cars were withdrawn, and that led to the setting up of the free buffets for the troops. So when a troop train was moving through the country, it would stop somewhere like Preston, Kettering was another one, Retford was another, and they would all dive into the free buffet, get a cup of tea or coffee and some biscuits or sandwiches, back on the train, and off they'd go again. Slip coaches largely ceased to be used, although some slip operation did restart after the war. I think it was in the 1950s when it finally stopped completely. A slip coach is when you run an express, generally out from London, with slip coaches on the rear, with a coupling that you can just pull a lever and release the coupling, and you have a guard that rides in the front of it. And so when you get to a station like Banbury or something, sort of 40 or 50 miles out, you release the coach, the driver then accelerates the train, the signal changes the point, the coach runs in under its own momentum with the guard controlling its speed to stop it in the platform. And then a shunter comes out on the back of it and puts it away in the sidings once it's empty. Obviously, you can only do it in the down direction. In the up direction, the train has to stop and have the coach added back onto it again. But that was quite a common practice before the First War, and it lasted until into BR days. There were branch line closures, sometimes because of lack of traffic. The one that I know particularly, the North Wales narrow gauge, what eventually became the Welsh Highland, that closed in 1916 for lack of traffic, because it was basically taking tourists to go up Snowdon. And others, the Basingstoke and Alton, for example, was closed and the track was lifted and sent to the front. The branch line, the original line to Henley and Arden, which was kept as a freight-only branch, that was lifted. So there were lines that were lifted just to send the material over to France. Some were reinstated, some weren't. Quinton's Hill, the worst accident in British Railways history. It was a change of shift signallers, and the signaller who was going off duty had got 4 trains approaching him, and one of them was a slow train, which was the front of the queue. Sorry, there was a freight train which he put in a loop. Then there was a stopping passenger train, and there was an express behind it. So he moved the stopping passenger train over onto the up line, stood it there outside his box to let the express go through. The shift change happened. The new signaller didn't understand what the position was, and he cleared the signals for the an up express or up through train, which ran straight into the static train, and then the northbound express, the down express, ran into the whole lot. So 215 people died and 191 were injured. The majority of those who died were Scots Guards on their way to the front, but there were some children as well. The carriages were old wooden coaches from the Great Central with gas lighting, which made the whole thing worse. Having been involved in accident investigation, perhaps more than many people have looked at it, there's always a tendency to blame the signallers. I don't blame the signallers. I blame the Caledonian Railway Company, because there were no track circuits, and that was well into the time of track circuits. And had there been track circuits, they wouldn't have been able to clear the signals for the up train to run in. And both the signallers went to jail for relatively short terms, and their families were looked after by the railway. And I suspect that a deal was done that they would carry the can but not suffer too badly. And the railways, the Caledonian Railway, would get the blame, which it didn't. Not one of the better issues for the industry. And the Scots Guards who survived were basically picked up, taken back to Edinburgh, reformed, and then sent on another train out to the front. Ambulance trains, it's a posed picture, but it just gives you some idea of the wounded having to come back. And of course, we talk about all the people who died in the war, but the numbers who were injured were horrendous. Feeding Scapa Flow, they wanted Rhondda Coal because it was smokeless. And so 79 freight trains a week were having to go from the Rhondda to Grangemouth. The only photo I've ever found of them is this one going up Shap, the London North Western Compound 080, and something behind it shoveling. And then the coal was loaded into ships at Grangemouth and sailed from there to Scapa Flow. And the thought was that the southern half of the North Sea wasn't safe to sail in, so you go to Grangemouth and then take the coal north from there. And the Jellicoe Express ran from Euston to Thurso, and from Thurso to Euston every day. It took best part of 24 hours to do it. I think it's the longest timetable service ever operated in the UK. And it continued running until 1919. As part of the centenary of the war, I worked with John Yellowlees and various other people to put up plaques at all the stations where the Jellicoe Express had stopped, including one in the swimming pool at Hawick, because of course most of the other stations are still in use, but Hawick very sadly is definitely not. Another post photo, but this is the free buffet at Paddington, and this was actually the last day of the buffet and the final customers.
It's on the old lawn, isn't it?
I think, I'm not sure where it is to tell you the truth. It probably is, yes. I've mentioned shells before, and there were massive numbers of works involved in producing shells. Even Boston Lodge was set on to produce shells. And Eric Geddes, who'd been general manager of the North Eastern Railway, as Minister of Munitions by this stage, and there are letters from the railway companies writing to him saying, for God's sake, tell us what you want and stick to it. We've got works sitting who are not producing anything at the moment because we haven't got clear instructions as to what we want. That was a big problem. What else did they produce? They produced the ambulance trains. They produced tanks, although it was mainly the locomotive factories that produced tanks rather than the railway works. But they certainly produced cordite, they produced wagons, and they produced locos for the front. So there was a lot of construction going on for the war. Horwich Works producing shells. Isn't that a rather splendid lot of belt drive equipment? You know, there's health and safety.
Not a lot of guarding.
Yes, exactly. But also, how few men there are. Got to look quite hard to spot any, mainly women doing the work. And there's Swindon converting one of their traditional GWR coaches into an ambulance train. And the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railways ambulance train ready for delivery. That's a Swindon-built rectangle wagon. So when you think about First World War tanks, the size of them actually was governed largely by the British loading gauge. And a lot of them, these turrets on the side where the guns were removable so that they could be taken off, deliver the wagon, and then bolt them back on again when you get to the front. That's an anti-aircraft gun being produced at Swindon. I have a suspicion that that's a Second World War photo rather than a First World War one, but it still shows the sort of thing the works were doing. And I don't think the railway ever built gun barrels, but they certainly built gun carriages. We all know where that is with the mouldings of the carvings of the Great Western broad gauge locos on the works at Swindon that we can still see as we go in on the train there. All that equipment was produced. They then all had to be shifted across the UK, across the Channel, and through northern France to the rear of the front line. So it's a pretty massive job. And as I've said, there's also all the stuff coming back: the wounded, the shell cases, equipment that needed refurbishing. Oh, by the way, we've got other wars going on as well, particularly in the Middle East. So there's Swindon again, preparing material for loading. And Wolverton Works, and they ran a weekly train from Wolverton with all the stuff they'd produced, which was dispatched off to the military. You can see there gun carriages, ammunition carriages, barges, all that lot is sent on one train. And then that's got to be remarshalled at some point to go to the various points on the front, whether that was done in France or idea. And from 1917 onwards, this is Knotty Ash, but it's not the Knotty Men. Oh God, that joke's getting very flat these days. People don't remember Ken Dodd, obviously. But the US Army was around. They generally came in on the western ports for obvious reasons and had to be moved south and taken over the Channel. There was some bomb damage, not as much, but 9 people were killed at Liverpool Street. There certainly was a bombing raid on Derby Loco Works. I can see there a signal box that's taken a battering. Other problems, apart from the damage to the railway from bombs, was a shortage of locomotives, because, of course, a lot of locos had been taken out of service and dispatched across to France. There's minimal new construction. A lot of the new construction was going straight to France. A lot of the fitters were in France, and a lot of locos that should have been withdrawn and scrapped were being kept going through the war. So there's a constant shortage of locomotives. A very minor thing, but the War Military Railway, better known as the Long War Military Railway, was set up and was used to start training troops during the Great War. Not at its biggest then, it became much bigger between the wars. And then we get stuff to the Channel, you then got to get it across. Southampton, Dieppe was the main route, Folkestone to Calais was used, and a complete new port was built by the South Eastern Chatham Railway Richborough, which was a temporary port, just for the duration of the war, basically. A lot of stuff went by rail, but some went by lorry, and quite a bit in bulk, which of course is another problem. So all of those meant there was a lot of handling to get stuff onto the ferries and off the ferries. So there's a fairly typical ferry. Coaches, probably an ambulance train either coming back or going out. I think going out, looking at the state of the lorries. So you've got a mixture of road and rail on that ferry about to leave Southampton. And troops coming back at Folkestone, disembarking, presumably back for leave. There's one of the Richborough ferries, absolutely full to the gunwales. That's Richborough, the loading. And you can see that the big crane to lift the rails up and down with the tide. So that wherever the ship was, you could create the right gradient to get the trains on, no matter what the state of the tide was. And there at Calais has to be at high tide. I'm not sure I'd want to take a wagon down that ramp. And then we get into France. Basically, the French, by the end of 1914, said, that bit's yours. We're taking all our engines and all our railwaymen to run our railways further south. So we suddenly found ourselves with the whole of the northern French railway system. Fortunately, that meant that a lot of professional railwaymen got out there quickly to run it and make sure that things like return wagons were taken on. And there was a railway operating division run by railwaymen. So the army said what it wanted and the ROD delivered it. So it worked, but there was massive demand for loco wagons, of course, and damage to the infrastructure near the front line. And you could divide the war almost into 2/3 bits. There's 1914, the first 4-5 months, when the great German advance and then the German retreat back to what became the Western Front by the end of 1914. And then 15, 16, 17, the first 3 months of 18, this sort of hell of the Western Front, where advances and retreats were measured in yards, not miles. And then March 1918, the final German fling, when they advanced through the Western Front and way to the west, not quite as far as they got in 1914, and then ran out of everything. And the British Army and the French Army and the American Army, which arrived fresh, pushed them back through the Western Front and back into Belgium, at which point there was the armistice. The war never actually got into Germany. But keeping up with those advances and retreats changed how the railway worked quite drastically. So you've got the bulk material, which comes out in sacks and then has to be loaded into wagons. You need lots of people handling bulk material, box goods, and a lot of Empire troops, Indian troops, Chinese were brought in to do that. And again, we've got the problem that people, military, are holding wagons at the front line as their mobile stores and then wondering why the transport system isn't working. Just a couple of pictures of return traffic. The top one is uniforms, presumably from the wounded, but being sent back to be repaired and ready for reuse, and damaged lorries going back for repair as well. So there's a lot of stuff going back over the channel in the reverse direction as well. Yes, and there you see a nice modern example of Mr. Kirtley's motive power, which the Midland Railway, I'm quite sure, were only too pleased to shuffle off onto the ROD. But I doubt that was particularly an effective locomotive. The Great Central, the Robinson 280, on the other hand, was a very effective locomotive, one of the best pre-World War I locomotives. And that became the ROD's standard freight locomotive, and vast numbers of these were built by the private contractors in the First War. And a lot of them were left over. The LNER obviously had a lot, but the Great Western ran these engines, and quite a lot were run in Australia as well, because there was quite a surplus of very good, very modern 280s at the end of the war. So they sold all over the place. And at the start of the Second War, they seriously talked about restarting the production line for these before they decided they'd stick with Stanley as aid freight instead as the standard loco. And of course, the inevitable happens. You lose trains on derailment. So what do? You push it out of the way, put the rails back and carry on regardless. And that's the sort of thing that they were keeping the railways going with. Interestingly, the low level there by the canal was part of the 2-foot gauge system, and it's the bit of the 2-foot gauge that has survived, the Flossy-Dampier line. It doesn't look anything like that now, but the 2-foot gauge at the low level is still there. And I've already said the problems that happened, particularly as the Germans retreated in 18, they were scorched earth behind them, so they were demolishing everything on the railway to try and stop the Allies from advancing to keep up with them. That picture, I'm sorry, I didn't cut all the text out of it, but it gives you a pretty fair idea of the sorts of things that the army and the army railways were dealing with towards the end of 1918. Field Marshal Haig's HST, the headquarters staff train. I don't know who the gentleman stood to Haig's left is, but I guess from the boards and everything that there's some foreign VIP who'd been to meet Haig, about to be driven away in a vehicle on the left-hand side. I've hinted a couple of times that the standard gauge mainline railways were fine getting up to the rear of the front line, but they were no use for getting stuff up to the front. You've all seen the photos. It was a hellhole full of mud. You had to have something lighter. The French and the Germans had both developed 60-centimetre gauge railways, the Feldbahn with the Germans, the Decauville, the French. We hadn't. And we started with the guys developing their own trench tramways with wooden rails to just push trucks forward and get the shells to the front. And the War Department realised very rapidly this wasn't going to work. And they developed a system of 2-foot gauge railways, which by 1916 was a really effective way of shifting stuff over those last 3 or 4 miles up to the front. And we talk about the technology cycle, the WD light railways, the ultimate technology cycle from invention, development, maturity, redundancy in the space of just over 2 years. Because from March 1918, it was no use at all, because the front was moving so fast they could not move the 2-foot gauge around to where the front was. More transshipment, in this case from narrow gauge, standard gauge down to narrow gauge. You see some Chinese troops there shifting stuff out of the standard gauge wagon into a D-class bogie wagon. And how to lay 2-foot gauge track in a hurry. And you've got lots of troops. And it could go anywhere, literally through the buildings. But it was a complex system. In the bottom right picture is one of the workshops, the marshalling yard, top left, the junction, the station, the track being maintained, the bridge with a petrol electric loco running over the top there. So it wasn't just a 2-foot gauge tramway, it was a proper railway system. Various sorts of locomotive. Top left is the Baldwins, which were the majority, there were nearly 500 of those. The British Motor Railway industry managed to produce 100 Hunslet 460s, which is the top right loco. But that was as much as they could have capacity to do. So most of the orders went to the States. And you can see the top left train moving crates of some sort. Top right one, an ambulance wagon. Bottom right is a blow up of the picture we saw of the bridge with a petrol electric loco hauling troops in D-class wagons. Bottom left is Simplex's works in Bedford, where they were turning out 20 horsepower and 40 horsepower engines, with the 40 horsepower having different degrees of armoured protection. That was one of the less protected ones. And the reason they had all these internal combustion engines was that you could get up to about a mile or 2 miles back from the front with the steam engine, but if you try to get any further forward at night, you could see the sparks and ain't shelter. So they moved to internal combustion for that final bit of delivery. See there a mobile workshop and artillery being moved on the 2 foot, the same sort of gun trucks that we saw at Swindon Works being moved on the standard gauge wagon, now being moved on 2 foot gauge. The specification for the locos was they should have a 3-week working life. So I just thought I'd show you the 3 weeks working life of some of the engines in 2019. They forgot about the other 100 years. So what have we got there? We've got Mountaineer, sold to the Tramway de Petit Vieux, which ran it until the 1960s, and it's been on the Festiniog ever since. It's been out of service for a few years. It's being overhauled at the moment. Marianne, the longest serving internal combustion engine on any British railway. Joined the Festiniog in about 1922. One of the simplexes, and from oil in there, a US Army Baldwin locomotive. Festiniog bought it in 1923, again still in use. So the second longest serving internal combustion engine on any British railway. And then Hunslet 303 here on the right hand side, which we just borrowed for the weekend. That worked in Queensland and then came back to the UK. So they're 102 years into their 3-week working life. But at the very front line, you're still back to hand hauling and trench tramways. And I just put that in to give some idea of the horrors it must have been like on the front line. Brief diversion, couple of campaigns, 3 campaigns in the Middle East. Obviously, there was Gallipoli, which was Churchill's idea. Did not work at all well. I was very fortunate because my grandfather was one of the last people to be out of Gallipoli. He then worked in Mesopotamia, what we now call Iraq, but there was also the Palestine campaign where we invaded north from the Suez Canal and reached Jerusalem and then had to go on from there. And here we see the trains at Jerusalem, London Southwestern trains, and London Southwestern Loco there as well. But the same sort of issues on a smaller scale that they faced on the Western Front, they were certainly facing here as well, having to send stuff out to support these operations. We reckon 200,000 railwaymen served in the Great War. Some are in the front line, some are in support roles. We know 23,000 died. That's figures pretty accurate. There was a service in 1919 at St Paul's that honoured the fallen railwaymen, which the King requested and attended, and they produced a book for that. And you can check the names on that, and if you also check the numbers on the war memorials, you come around the 23,000 mark. Which are people pretty close, which is roughly the number of people that work for Network Rail today. There were 8 Victoria Crosses won by railwaymen. 4 posthumous, 4 of them survived the war. I'm only going to talk about one of them, Alan Lewis, because I think what happened to Alan Lewis was utterly disgraceful. Alan Lewis came from Hereford and for reasons unknown moved to Neath, where he was a bus driver employed by the Great Western Railway. He joined up as a volunteer some way into the war. By the time they had got control of railway and going to war, and basically you were only supposed to leave the railway and go to war if you had approval from the company and from the government. And he didn't. He resigned and he went to war. And the Great Western totally disowned him. And he was killed and he won the Victoria Cross. So what did the Great Western do? He's not on the Rolls of Honour. He's not in the 1919 book. He's not at Paddington. And people who were like that, they lost their pensions, they lost their company house, they lost everything. in fairness to today's Great Western Railway, they recognise that there is an IEP named after him, and we have put plaques on the station in English and Welsh honouring him. But the only reason we know about him is because my secretary went to the Hay Book Festival, and they were raising money for a statue of Alan to put up in Hereford, which they have done now. And Claire went and said, "Oh yes, we're trying to honour all the railwaymen who won the Victoria Cross. We're doing plaques for them. Well, my great uncle was a railwayman, and you're not doing anything for him." Claire came back and told me this. What? We can't have missed one. We had. Nobody in the industry knew anything about him until then. So I think we've now done him properly, but I don't think that reflects any great credit on what that how the railway treated those who went to war. At the other extreme, you have individual tales of heroism, and Captain Friars, of course, a Great Eastern Railway ship's captain, was involved in an incident where a submarine tried to get his ship, and he just charged his ship at the submarine. The submarine submerged and got out of the way, and he got a medal, a watch, honouring him for this from the GER. Some years later, his ship was captured, and they decided that because he was a civilian, that was a war crime. They used the watch as evidence against him and shot him. Sure. Yes. So there's some GWR staff lined up after they volunteered at Paddington. That's John Michael VC's plaque. John worked at Nitz Hill with the 8 stations where the VC winners worked. We put plaques on all of them, or the nearest stations that closed. And in all bar one, we managed to find members of the family. One of them, Jacob Rivers at Derby, he died. He had no descendants, but we did a massive amount of work on his family once we eventually made contact with him. And they were 10 to a generation. Between 1914 and now, there's about 80 or 90 different legs to the family, all in Derby, none of them knowing each other. We actually reunited the whole family. And when we unveiled the plaque, we had the first class lounge at Derby, and we had the family tree roughly from the end of the screen there to about where the partition is up on the wall, so they could all see how they all related to each other. There's the memorial to Captain Friars at Liverpool Street on the left, and his grave at Dover Court near Harwich. I'm very pleased to say that the grave, which was getting a bit tatty, we were able to fund its restoration with some RHT funds. And this van, you come back to your Holby Douglas, is the standard Southern Region van. Except this is the prototype. It was built for the Southeastern Chatham. Somebody bought it. They just bought a Southern Southeastern GUV van, and then gradually it turned out not only was it the prototype of the design, but it was actually this wagon that was used to bring back the bodies of Captain Friars, Nurse Edith Cavell, and the Unknown Warrior. So massive historic importance, preserved purely by fluke, and it's now on the Kent and East Sussex Railway. And if the Unknown Warrior loco had ever come to success with mainline running, I think we'd have tried to put it behind the Unknown Warrior. But I think if that ever gets together, it'll be on heritage lines only. And a lot of men went to war, and we saw the photo of Harwich, the women doing jobs they'd never done before. And it started mainly on clerical work roles, but it spread out to many more roles that were thought to be men only. The unions don't come out of this at all well. They fought to keep the jobs for men. They insisted that the women were paid less than the men, that they had to be discharged as soon as the men came back from the war. But I think what happened with the female employees during the war showed that women were capable of doing most of the jobs that men do, and the only real issue is physical strength. And the advances that we've seen in women's equality in the last 100-odd years, I think, started with the mobilisation of women in the Great War, which the railway was very much in the lead. So we see ticket clerk, working in some sort of factory, obviously stewards on the trains, some cleaning the locomotives. I don't think we ever find, or we did actually find one photo of a woman signaller. It's pretty unique. And then we come to war memorials. So these are three of the big four war memorials: the Great Western one at Paddington, the unveiling of the London North Western LMS one at Euston, and the Victory Arch at Waterloo. And my view is that the railway companies, because they were going to lose their own identity, put a lot of effort into the war memorials of the pre-looping railways in their last days, because most of the war memorials were actually unveiled in 22, 23. So, as I said, put a lot of effort into finding what there is and finding what's not covered. And one place that was not covered, Colonel Stevens or no Colonel Stevens, was the Festiniog. And we did a lot of research, and we found that 2 employees of the Festiniog had fallen in the war, and several others had served. So my colleague Malcolm Wood designed a plaque. The Railway Heritage Trust funded the plaque. The Festiniog supporter funded the base, and that went up at Tannold and was unveiled on the centenary of the armistice. Again, we had families that had fallen there. Right. Nearly at the end, this is the memorial that was done by the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Carriage and Wagon Works. It listed all the men who had served on those 6 panels, all the men who'd fallen on those 2. And that went up in their carriage works at Newton Heath in the early 1920s. And of course, in 1928, the LMS is formed. Do we need a carriage works at Newton Heath when we've got the main carriage works at Crewe and Derby? Answer, no, so they closed the carriage works. And nobody knew what had happened to this. Completely vanished from trace. And then sometime in the 1980s, it may even have been the early 1990s, they were doing some work at Piccadilly. Some of the guys came along to see the DCE, an old mucker of mine, Richard Law. And they said to Richard, boss, we think you better come and have a look at what we've just found downstairs in Piccadilly. And what they had found was this: the 3 boards with the names, all the framing had gone. And Richard had those shipped to the East Lancashire Railway, but the East Lancashire Railway never had space to put them up, so they just stayed in store. And eventually I was approached, and we found this photo, thank God. So with the shadow marks on the plaques and that photo, we were able to know what it should look like. We've got a firm in York that recreated all the mouldings. And then there we see it in position before the mouldings are put up. And there's a rededication service to it back at Newton Heath, not in its original location, but in the depot at Newton Heath. And it's being unveiled on the 28th of June 2019, which is of course the centenary of the Versailles Treaty and the end of the war. I think that's probably enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. I'm sure there's some questions going to come out of this. Is there any questions from anyone on online?
Goes off the minute.
Okay, fine. Is there any questions for Andy?
Could you excuse us, Mr. Chairman, please vote against on it completely?
Yeah. Right.
Shall we say a call?
Okay, any questions?
Just one reflection, really. If you watched any of the war programs on television, channels like yesterday, one of the constant sort of difficulties of all advancing armies is keeping in touch with their supply lines.
Yes.
be it on the Allied side or on the German side or Russian.
Yeah,
They all seem to have that problem. You know, you've got the army at the front wanting to push ahead and capitalise on their advance. But of course, they forget the problems behind of bringing up all the supplies, which have even been destroyed in the last hour.
well, I mean, you only have to look at the initial Russian advance into Ukraine and how much they had to retreat back. You know, we tend to forget that the Russians have got probably less than half what they had in the early days of the Ukraine. Because they hadn't got their logistics right.
Did I imagine it, or were those 2-foot gauge track panels, weren't they ever made with steel sleepers?
There's certainly Jubilee track with steel sleepers is a very common feature of industrial railways in the 1920s and 30s. I'm quite used to working with it because when we built deviation on the Festiniog, we used Jubilee track all the way. Still a lot of it around. Whether it was used in the Great War, I don't know. Certainly there were more sleepers there than there would be for Jubilee track.
It certainly features in one or two of the Michael Portillo programs of recent years.
Yeah.
When he was trying to, you know, by putting 2-foot gauge panels into
Yes, that's what I was
overlay
saying.
a mile of track.
Yeah, well, I'm very heavily involved in the Darjeeling tank that's just been preserved, the one that Adrian Shooter used to. And one of the things we're looking at is whether to have 200 yards of Jubilee type track. It's got to be pretty solid to take that engine because it's quite heavy. But so we can take the engine and the coaches round, particularly to Indian festivals. There's still Jubilee track around.
There must have been a huge amount for industrial purposes at the time as well, wasn't it?
Well, there are photos of literally hundreds of engines in store in Kent after the war.
Nobody put that.
They're only there for some years because, say, the festival, Welsh Highland, they bought 590 for the Welsh Highland, which was a Baldwin 460. They brought Mary Ann, they brought the Baldwin, all of those in about 1923. So that's 4 years after the war has ended. The stuff's still there waiting for buyers. But I mean, there are Baldwins in India. There are about 15 or 20 ran in the UK between the wars, mainly at Ashover, but Welsh Island, Snail Beach, one or two other places as well. Colonel Stevens was quite keen on them. Glyn Valley had one. And some of the Hunslets were up near Fort William on a hydroelectric railway there. There were Hunslets in Argentina. There were certainly engines in Australia because we brought some of them back. So a lot of 2-foot gauge locos went all over the place. I mentioned I made a particular as well.
Well, it ended up in France after the war was on Belgium.
Yeah, yeah.
The sugar beet railways and things like that. Yeah.
Well, particularly Artoria was largely a sugar beet railway, but of course that was way away from where the fighting was.
Yeah.
Between Paris and the move.
Andrew.
What sort of difficulty occurred because of the variation in gauge? It's not much, but in railway terms, it's great between a 2-foot gauge railway and a 500 or 600 millimetre metric gauge. And how did it work out in practice?
As far as the World War I railways was concerned, I don't think there's any substantial difference. I don't know what gauge it actually was. I have known problems in terms of Festiniog. Certainly there was a derailment, a couple of derailments with Linda and Blanche when they first arrived because they were set for 1 foot 10 3/4. The Festiniog was 1 foot 11 1/2. And both those engines derailed in the early days. And we've never had a Vale of Rydal engine in the Festiniog because of the back-to-back issues. But we have had Festiniog engines on a Vale of Rydal.
The MOD has had a lot of problems with it because I've personally been involved with sorting out their problems because they freely mixed 2-foot gauge and 60 centimetre gauge equipment because the two thing was 2-foot gauge in the First World War. And whilst everything was all clapped out and everything, it didn't really matter. But when they bought some new turnouts, they kept derailing wagons, and it took some while to work out that some vehicles had 60 centimetre axle one end and 2 foot gauge the other. Yeah, so they,
I mean, the big ones are the engines we brought back from South Africa, because all those big Bear Garretts, the Mikado, which is about to enter service, were very definitely 610.
So it's fairly fundamental how far apart the wheels are though. And
It is, but 2 foot covers anything. I think 610 is the widest.
which
which
is,
also has a range, I'm sorry, I don't.
And I'm not sure what 110 3/4 is. Somebody can leave that as an exercise for the student, but that's the smallest 2 foot gauge I've known, which Penryn and Denoric used.
Right, I'd always assumed that 2 foot meant.
No,
yeah,
Frestonnier gauge is 598.
Right, in which case I'm obvious.
yeah. And indeed it happens all the time. The Ratty and the Romney Island Dimchurch don't use the same check gauge either, as they found out at the Liverpool Garden Festival. So, like, people just aren't so interested now. Right, any more questions for Andy?
Sorry to add for the property side, so I always get lost on track issues. But it just, with memorials, it's very, say with Paddington or something, it's very obvious, it's very big, clear. I remember at Cardiff, there was involved, we tried to get the names together for a plaque to go back up on the wall there, after I assume we lost some stuff inside the concourse there and so on. But it's keeping track of the smaller items as well. I know Great Western used to set up, there was a poster, wasn't there?
Yeah.
The Great Wall.
Yeah, the ones on Central Station are new ones.
Yes, they are.
I've no record of there ever having been memorials here, and it's unlikely. The one that does not exist, as far as I'm aware, one of the biggest gaps is the Romney. We know where the Barry Railway is. We know where the Taff Vale Railway is, and there's a replica of the Taff Vale Railway one on display at Queen Street, which I organised. But I've never found a memorial for the Romney or any trace of there having been one. But I can tell you, I've got a database that's not in my head because there's lots of stuff, but most of the locomotives that have war memorial names and most of the actual war memorials have a pretty good idea where they are, if they still exist.
I can't think of it. I know there's one of the Shrewsbury Plus bucket inside there, so.
Yeah, well, the Great Western Memorial Rolls of Honour in a lot of locations, and we actually funded renewing some of them about 15, 20 years ago, just before I joined the trust.
Yeah, okay, more questions? Right, thank you, Andy. So, I'd like to call on to John Davis to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. Yes. Fascinated, absolutely fascinated. I don't know much about railway history, let alone war history, but today is the most interesting. I've had association with the speaker over a long time ago. Cumbrawn Station, I think, was the first thing we really got together on. Another thing I've seen on the outside is Kinhorny Viaduct. I remember you inviting me to abseil down with you, and I declined on a trip out because I was with the provincial services in British Rail. And one or two things I've seen from that. The law of unintended consequences is nothing new, seemed to be very much to the fore in those First World War days. And the fact that we don't learn from, history shows we don't learn from our mistakes. We're still making the same sort of mistakes today, as far as I can see, absolutely worse. But fascinating to see the facts and figures and just how much, was done. We've had to think how on earth could we done all those things with technology much less developed than it is today. So thank you very much. A really good and interesting thing. Well worth my trip from Swansea to come and listen to. Thank you.
Before I close the meeting, did everyone sign the attendance sheet? It's up here if anybody has. Awesome. So our next meeting, and again on a a historical note is the core valley lines in the past by Dr. Adrian Humpage. That'll be our next meeting on Monday, the 11th of March. He's with the Welsh Railways Research Circle. The 8th of April, we have
You've muted Andy for the last 30 seconds or so.
I don't think he can hear you.
Oh, next time.
Yeah, but as long as it's not important, I've got the bet for the next meeting. So as long as we go to the 11th, we'll know about the 8th and whatever it is anyway. So that's good.
Ideal.